This, this is the AP guy, no?
I am an editor for Oak Science, right? Yeah, but
So that's why I'm saying.
yeah, that's why you, yeah. I wish I had the what? Is there a way to charge your computer here also?
Well, there is here.
Okay, if you can have a seat, please. We're going to get started because it's the time. My name is Fernando Suarez, and I have the pleasure of coordinating and being the moderator in this panel discussion. We have two great discussions today, and I think I'll just make a few introductory remarks and then go straight into the issue. As you know, the topic today is whether we're testing enough our management theories. And I think it's an important topic because it relates to the issue of rigor versus relevance, which really haunts us for years and years. And I think it's an interesting topic to discuss. We're going to take a little bit of a dive here with two great discussants, Gautam Ahuja from the University of Michigan and Brent Goldford from Maryland. They have different positions on this, and we have discussed them. And I think you're going to see, different perspectives on the issue. I just want to make a few clarifications. First, what this plenary is not about, and I think we kind of agree on this. First one is that we're not going to discuss what constitutes a theory. I mean, we're going to use the word theory rather loosely, okay? There's a difference between a framework and a theory and then schools of thought. We're not going to get into that discussion because we'll be here for the rest of the afternoon. I think there are more interesting issues to discuss today, okay? And sometimes those discussions gets a bit philosophical. And the second thing is that even though we're going to be using examples from different frameworks and different theories, we're not going to try to debunk or endorse a particular theory. And I say this with carefully saying it because I know that my colleagues will actually bring up some of those theories and either have, positive or not so positive comments about them. But I think the intent is really to use the theories as an example to have a more informed discussion of these issues. I think, if you look at why is it important to actually have empirical verification, you can have two basic reasons. One of them is that we're all scientists and we are, seeking the truth. Isn't that true? And I think, that's it's a bit of an obvious question. And of course, I will ignore all the other objectives we have in our objective function, like, getting tenure and getting published. And we are really, searching for the truth. And the second objective or important reason for why we would like to have verification in empirics is because we do want ultimately our theories to be helpful for managers. And here the assumption is, and I'm sure we'll hear it in a little while, the assumption is that untested theories can be dangerous, that untested theories actually can misguide managerial action, and we shouldn't be doing this, because we can do better than that. I think it is not a surprise that if I put a whole bunch of theories, quote, that we have used extensively in the past, you will realize that the fact of the matter is that if you ask yourself, are these theories properly tested? Can we, say for sure that they're 100% tested? The answer is no. In fact, a lot of these theories, I have done some work in some of them, like, for instance, in first mover advantages, and, lots of people have done this, and I haven't seen Marvin Lieberman this time around, but I'm sure he's probably around, and Dave Montgomery have done great work on this, and then after them and before them, a lot of work has been done in this idea of first mover advantage, and if that is a theory, it's actually the empirical evidence is quite slim, and even Marvin and Dave will recognize that the empirical regularities, coming out of those empirical studies are very, very, very slim. They're just far and between. So I think the reality is that a lot of the theories we use as scholars and that we sort of pass on to the practitioners are not well tested. And I think in that, Brent has a point. Brent will be sort of the empirics guy in the panel, and he will actually dig hard on this because I think he's right on this. The reality is that a lot of our theories are not properly tested. Now the question is, what can we do? And I think if this is true, then the question is, why is it? Why is it that we have been so far unable to test our theories? And you can think of different possible explanations. First one is that we can blame the managers because they don't give us the data. And that's actually true in many sense. I mean, oftentimes we want to get data and the managers just don't give it to us. And, or these consulting companies charge us a lot of money for the data. And so that's one reason. The second reason, and I think Brent will dig into this, is that our standard for empirical analysis may be low. This is a hard pill to swallow for us, because in a way it's basically saying, that we kind of suck as a community of scholars doing empirical research, and it's a little bit of a strong statement. I just want to be provocative here. But another possibility would be that our peer community does not reward replication and testing. There are doctoral students here, and there are advisors of doctoral students, and how many times you have heard a doctoral student hearing from their advisor that they should not worry about having their own idea, that you can just go and test somebody else's idea, and that'll be fine, and that'll be a good dissertation. And the reality is that that doesn't happen. We are always looking for, your own idea on something, and we're looking for those gaps, and the gaps get increasingly smaller, and that's actually part of the problem. So I think there is also that problem in our community. Then the next point is that the issues we study are simply too complex to have a theory that really works well in most situations. And that, the reality is that we don't have the luxury that other fields of study have, and that also could be explaining why is it that our empirical validation is so slim. It could also be all of the above, and it's most likely it's all of the above, and this is actually a little bit of an issue. And then, we all kind of regret that we cannot say the same thing as other fields of study do, which is this very clean pattern of paradigms and coming from Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions, in which you have anomalies on a particular theory that is being upheld for the time being, and then you have a crisis that sort of opens up new ways of looking at the problem, and then you have, of course, a pre-paradigmatic stage in which you have alternative theories that will vie for dominance, and one of them becomes the dominant paradigm, and then we go back to normal theory. And that's great, and we have sort of that idea ingrained in our minds, but in reality, if you look at our problem, is that we don't have the same type of luxury oftentimes, and our testing, therefore, has to do with this extra complication that we're not dealing with celestial bodies or atoms. We're actually dealing with organizations and people that actually are often very hard to predict. And the reality is that when you look at that Kuhnian circle, I think it's easy to conclude that we typically don't have the last stage. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, if you look at all of the theories that I just mentioned, I think we kind of live in a perennial state of pre-paradigmatic stage, in which we have lots of theories that overlap. I mean, think of how many even taxonomies that overlap. Think of how many taxonomies of innovation we have, just to begin with, in the TIM division. And so I think, there is also an important understanding here that, perhaps the idea that we have about replication and about paradigms and, testing something that becomes the norm and accepted by most scholars is probably a luxury that is harder to come by in our field. But Brent might argue, and I think he will in a little while, that, we are in kind of a golden era of testing. Why? Because, well, many things. First of all, the internet and IT systems now are ubiquitous, and we have a lot more data than we had in the past. I see Jim Auerbach sitting here. I remember when we were doing our papers, I spent weeks in the library collecting those data. Now, actually, you can get on the internet and find a lot of data that is actually readily available. I've been talking to some people, young people, that are in the market this year, because we have an opening, as many schools do, and I've been surprised of the richness of the data sets. They're granular, they're very micro, very interesting data sets. So I think this is actually true. I mean, we have more opportunities now. Then the second thing is that we have a lot more computer power. And I don't need to repeat this, but what we have today in our laptops is actually amazingly powerful. And that, together with big data sets, large data sets, allows for better testing. And then finally, I think it's true that we have all learned in our profession to be more careful with the methods. And this idea that you have a whole bunch of different methodologies developed in the last decade or two that allow us to be a bit more careful and a bit more precise in terms of what we are measuring. And I think, you know, I don't think we're going to get technical, but probably Brent will discuss some of the importance of that issue. Of course, you know, this emphasis on methods also has is a double-edged sword, because, of course, first of all, you have to agree with me probably that even though we have had this important improvement in the methods, the reality is that our progress in testing the theories has been rather slow. I mean, we still, you know, we've been doing these things for 10, 20 years now, many of them, and we still cannot say, you know, for some of the theories if they're really working or not, in which situations. And maybe, you know, Brent and Gautam will have a different opinion on this. But I think also there's a danger that has been discussed by many that, you know, oftentimes when we just focus on methods, you actually can have the unwanted scenario that you end up actually doing nice answers for very unimportant and small questions. And that's something that we all have to be aware of in the empirical testing of things. So I think, you know, it is fair to ask ourselves if management theories are only useful if we can properly test them. And I think on this, let me just recap what I said, that I think, you know, there are too many important nuances and situations which are different. We don't have the same idea of replication as in other, and I know Brent will speak about replication, so I want him to address this idea that, yes, in physics and in other sciences, you can actually replicate and you can actually experiment and change different conditions. In our field, replication is trickier, to say the least. And then finally, the idea that, you know, our own understanding of how things work, which is what we use to test, is actually socially constructed, which is also important because that means that we have our own lenses that might not necessarily coincide with the real truth, if there is one out there. And then the second thing is that I want to rescue a concept put up together by Carl Weick in his 1995 book. And he was talking about accuracy versus plausibility. The idea that, you know, sometimes it really doesn't help to be, or to try to be accurate. And sometimes the plausibility will actually trump accuracy because plausibility acts as a platform for action. And I thought when I was preparing this introduction, I thought that concept was actually quite interesting. The idea that we can actually think of theories or the usefulness of a theory, not only when they are properly tested, because, as I said, perhaps we can never properly test a theory, but in our field, but when we think they are actually a good platform for action. And when I say action, I want to say two things. I'm not just referring to the practitioners, but also scholars. So I took the two theories that I know my colleagues here will be speaking about today, which are, you know, core competences and disruptive innovation, and both of them will be talking about this. And I actually just look at the impact on our scholarly field. Just first of all, just a simple count of one publication for each of these authors. So this is just one pub impact, and, you know, you see the impact is really quite amazing. You know, more than 10,000 sites for the Christensen 97 piece, and more than 20,000 sites for the Hameland-Prahalat 1990 piece. Of course, you can say, well, you know, Google Scholar catches everything, and that's not, you know, strict enough. So here's, you know, just the same thing, but just looking at 6 journals that you know, a lot of people consider sort of the top journals in strategy and innovation. Those are the list there, and the impact is pretty impressive still. And I have to say, you know, our doctoral student Diego Zunino was helping us in this graph, so I want to express that gratitude to him for putting together this data. Also, we looked at whether the impact lasts. So what we did here is actually to calculate the sites only for 2 journals. I mean, we want to be super strict. So the top is AMJ, which is basically, you know, an empirical journal, and the bottom half is AMR, which is a theory journal. And this is basically the number of citations in intervals of 3 years after the particular piece was published. And as you see here, what I want to highlight is that these are not fads. You know, these are not fads that die after 2 or 3 years. These are actually things that scholars, because these are AMJ and AMR, that's it. And so these are, you know, concepts that scholars continue to use over the years. And even today, we're using them. So I think that the resilience of these concepts is quite interesting. And so one thing that we need to answer is that, okay, so there are people doing empirical work up there and theory work on these issues. How comes that after 20 years, we still don't have a clear answer? And so that goes back to Brent's points to see, well, can we really do this? Or is it really that we're that bad that after 20 years and lots of work, we still cannot have clear answers for this? So I think, it's actually even more interesting when you look at dissertations. So what we did is actually, we looked at dissertations, doctoral dissertations that have in the title or the abstract. So this is pretty stringent, title or abstract, the word core competence or disruptive innovation. So these are people that at the center of their work actually are using these concepts. And what you see there is even more striking, that not only the amount of usage over time has remained super high, but they're still increasing in some cases. So I think what I'm trying to say with this is that I think these theories for us as scholars have been useful. I mean, useful. We might not side with a theory in particular, but have been useful as platform for action, and in our case means platform for thoughts and for actually improving our own understanding of phenomena. So I think the other question that I think we need to address, and this is actually what originated this whole discussion, was: are these things useful for managers? And in here, you can say, well, and I think this is pretty much what Brent's position would be on this, that, management theories which are not validated by empirical work are not very useful because, we might be misguiding managers. And yeah, so we can think of that, but it's a little bit arrogant, I think, in my view, for us to determine what is useful or not useful for managers. I think an alternative way would be to say, well, maybe management theories are useful when managers adopt them, when they use them, and when they think they help them in whatever situation they're dealing with. And I think, when you ask some managers about these issues, and all of you teach in classrooms, I do too, and I have managers in my classrooms, and I teach companies, and oftentimes, these theories help them make sense of situation, help them, make decisions. And so I think we have to be careful not to be sort of the arrogance in our ivory tower saying, well, we're going to tell you when these things are ready for you to use, okay? Because if not, you're not prepared to use them until we vet them with empirical work. So I think that's a little bit dangerous. So what I'd like to do is, and of course, the reality is that, this is the truth, that these things are hugely used by managers. So I just pulled out the information for the innovator's dilemma, the piece of Chris's that I'm mentioning, and of course it would be the same for core competence. I just couldn't find the information handy. But it is true that they're widely used. I mean, number one, selling books, and lots of distinctions from the practitioner side, so there's no question they're using it. And according to a lot of the anecdotal accounts, they're also, if they keep on using it, it's because they find it useful. That's what would be my thinking. So in finishing up, I would like to, to just end up with a provocative point. So how about if our theories cannot be tested? So how about if we, even if we try, for all of the reasons I just discussed, the theories cannot be tested, do they still have value? And I want to end up with this story that actually, that it was a story passed on by a Nobel Prize winner and then rescued by Carl Weick in his 1995 book, but it's actually a much older story. And in fact, even Weick published it way before. And it's this famous story that our OB colleagues will recognize right away of these Hungarian soldiers that got lost in the Alps during a heavy snowstorm. And the people in the base camp thought that they were totally lost and dead because after 3 days up there with this heavy storm, there was no way they could come back. But after 3 days, surprisingly, they reappeared. And when the lieutenant that was in the base camp asked them, what is it, how do you manage to get out of this thing? And they said, well, you know what, we thought we were totally lost and almost dead, and then one of us found a map in his pocket, and that, calmed us down. We waited for the storm to pass a little bit, and then we actually found our bearings and found our way out. And when the lieutenant asked to see the map, he realized that it was not a map of the Alps, but it was a map of the Pyrenees, okay? So that's the old moral, and it's a well-known story, but I think it's actually important here because the moral is that, maybe our theories are not precise, maybe they're not accurate, maybe they will never be because of the situation, but maybe they're still helpful for managers because they they serve as platform for actions. Okay, so these are the two things that we'll be dealing with today. think of our theories as in a perennial pre-paradigmatic stage in which we'll just use them as platform for thought and action, or that would, I think, will be Goddam's position. Maybe I'm guessing. And then I think what would be Brent's position is the second one, which is to strive to spend more effort with better methods to perform replication studies, and actually we can validate these theories. And maybe, again, the answer would be all of the above. So, okay, it's a good time to get to our panelists. Did we decide on the order?
Fine with either order.
I think it will be probably interesting to just go with Brent first, just because I think you'll be putting some contrast to this presentation. Thanks, Brent. Let me get your stuff up.
Good morning. So I really want to thank Keld and Fernando for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. So I'll just dig right in. So I kind of think we have a dual responsibility as scholars. This is very much what Fernando mentioned. We need to speak to ourselves correctly, but we also have to be pretty careful when we talk to practitioners, because some of our advice has real implications. And, in some sense, at least in terms of how we speak to ourselves, our problem is not unique and profound, and it has this kind of complication that goes back to Bacon, kind of the father of the scientific method, if you will. And he says, I can't remember which aphorism this is, but human understanding is of its own nature prone to suppose the existence of more order and regularity in the world than it finds. We like patterns, and we like to ascribe meanings to patterns, and often we do that when we probably should not. And so I want to just kind of throw out a definition. So epiphenia is actually a term from the psychological sciences. It means delusional, but the nice way to say delusional is the human tendency to seek patterns in random information. Right? But that really just means delusional. Andy King and I have coined a term called scientific apophenia, which isn't a pathology in the medical sense, but it's when you assign inferential meaning when limited statistical power should prevent such a conclusion, or when the data are just random. So we kind of distinguish, there's really two types of things. There's like the real false positives, there's nothing there, but we see something. And there's probably, about half the time, it's probably more like, there might be something there, but it's really weak, doesn't explain it a lot, so you're kind of seeing a very weak signal. But it's hard to say. And there's kind of three causes, or three flavors of this, if you will. There's the searching through asterisks. I'm just going to run a whole bunch of regressions over and over again. Something's going to turn out significant, and woohoo, I found some new, very interesting and significant in the statistical sense result. And Rich Bettis talks about this. So then over in the psychologists are very worried about p-hacking, and we should be too, where you kind of nudge samples and specifications to confirm your strong priors. And there's one thing that we're particularly guilty of, which I call kind of the availability problem. If it's published, it's true. Right? We do not go back and question things once they come out. So Annie King and I looked at this in a forthcoming article, and we looked at 300 papers from SMJ, AMJ, ASQ, Management Science, and Org Science from the last 2003 to 2012. It was the last 10 years when we started the project. And here's what we find, 26 or 40% of the results would not be replicated in a repeat study. So let me say that again. 25% to 40% of hypothesis tests in our leading journals would not stand the test of replication, where replication means, again, would show up at a 5% or 95% confidence level. Okay? So let me say this again. This is a big problem. Okay? 1 in 20 findings should not replicate rather, and we find that up to 8 in 20 will not replicate. Okay, so that made us kind of worried a little bit. I'm really going to focus on, for the rest of the talk, first of all, of course, I encourage you all to go read my paper, but after that, I'm really going to focus a little bit on the availability part, which really isn't the focus of that paper. And the question kind of comes down to, what does a single study really mean? And when you get an estimate from a distribution, what are you actually getting, right? So you're getting one estimate, that's my x there, and you say, well, here's the most likely distribution of the x, of my coefficient, right, of my estimate, and it's most likely that one, but that's one draw from the distribution. That's what a coefficient estimate actually is. That's why they call it an estimate, right? But so it could be coming from that distribution, in which case there's a lot of times there's no effect, and it could be coming from this one, which would say that the mean effect is 0, and this is what we call false positive. Okay? And the only way to really know this is to keep running more tests, and if you keep running more tests, then you get a much better estimate of the distribution, right? And that's what replication does. And that's why we have to replicate, and that's why looking at a single study really doesn't tell us almost anything about the way the world works. All it tells us is this is something really interesting that requires further study. So I think oh, that was supposed to be, that's kind of where it is. That's not quite a false positive, but it's not quite what we thought in the beginning. Okay, so the issue is that correcting false positives is really, really hard, right? And to disprove it, we actually need, you can actually do a kind of a calculation of this. To disprove one false positive, you actually need tens of studies of replication to actually figure out what that distribution looks like. You might do a little bit better, and you might be okay if you just want to say probably doesn't explain very much. You might not need tens. But this is just what is needed to understand the internal validity of our studies. So that's what we need when we say that something is published and so has shown that X causes Y based on one study. That is not true. All they've shown is that maybe it might be interesting, right? Okay, so the fix for scientific apophenia is replication. Okay, so one might argue, in fact, Fernando just argued that maybe we can be less strict of our demands because the theories don't have a direct effect on human lives, or one could say that they provide interesting ideas for suggestions, and they're really just to kind of build up our conversation, right? Or you could say that the environment's really messy and idiosyncratic, and it's impossible to replicate the norms of the physical sciences, and of course that's right, and social science is different. But we can do much better than we are doing, right? And in the process, when managers follow some of our theories and they're wrong, that costs a lot of money. Like billions of dollars get invested based on theories that have very little empirical and explanatory value. And that seems to me kind of shall we say, disrespect of our responsibility as scholars. Right? So now let's consider the theory of disruptive innovation. It has been used even quite recently to propose solutions from everything in the world, from poverty to healthcare to our own industry. Critical industries like print news have used it to provide a roadmap for survival. It's had an enormous effect. Okay, and so if you actually do, I did a kind of the poor man's version of the citation count search, right? So you can look, I looked for disruption theory, and Google told me that there were about 33 million results, and that's kind of the top one. That's what comes up. In fact, it's my picture. Well, actually, it's not my picture, but very close to it, right? And here I look for competitive advantage, and we learned what Wharton thinks is a good keyword, and it also, the very first thing is about Michael Porter stuff. So, disruptive, it seems odd that disruption theory should have as much as kind of something that sits at the foundation of our field, which is how do you get sustained competitive advantage. A recent HBR article, in fact, suggested that the reason for the downturn and the long recovery was that firms were not engaging enough in disruptive innovation, right? And it had a nice explanatory theory, right, which seems a little bit surprising given everything else we know in the world. So these are bold claims, and surely we should test it carefully, okay? So on the one hand, there have been some scholars, like Ron Adner, who has done a really constructive job clarifying the assumptions of demand and what needs to go into the theory. And just to kind of go over this, per Christensen and Bauer, a technology, later in the innovation solutions this becomes an innovation, but nevertheless, it's disruptive if it redefines what performance means. Right? And then this becomes a problem for the incumbent firms if the disruptive technology, I guess I should go back to this, if the disruptive technology eventually becomes sufficient to satisfy the incumbents. And the incumbent, then of course the incumbent has to fail to transition to the new technology. And then here's the key thing. So Christensen and Bauer's theory, the theoretical point is that the mechanism by which this happens is some sort of failure due to managerial short-term incentives and routines that reward the servicing of existing customers, right? And this leads the incumbents to ignore the disruptive technology. So, you know, what's the support? All right, so is the theory supportive? So it depends on where you look. In the scholarly literature, I would call it at best tenuous, right? So in fact, the evidence that the theory is a helpful description of the disk drive industry does not actually stand up. This is Clay's data, right? And this is predicting whether a company entered a new niche market, and the best predictor of whether a company enters a new niche market is whether they have production and sales experience. So the basic premise of the basic premise of the theory is not validated within the prototypical example that's used to support the theory, right? And this is a refutation paper, refutation with an F, that Andy King and Chris Tucci published in Management Science in 2002, which is nobody's heard of because it has the very attractive title of Incumbent Entry into New Market Niches, the Role of Experience and Managerial Choice in the Creation of Dynamic Capabilities, right? So it doesn't say, is disruption right, which probably would have attracted a lot of readers. I know for a fact in the review process, it was toned down to accommodate existing viewpoints. So this internal validity of King and Tucci's work has been supported in related work on disk drives by McKendrick from Silicon Valley to Silverthorne, and Hank Chesborough finds no evidence of incumbent failure for Japanese firms. And of course, Jill Lepore in the New Yorker in 2014, was it 2014? I think it was 2014. She wrote, she pointed out that one of the disrupted American firms, Seagate Technologies, had $14 billion in revenue in 1993, long after it had theoretically failed. Right? So, and of course, the great and sadly late Stephen Klepper has actually shown many benefits to incumbency, right? Not only within the same industry, but within related industries. In fact, he and Ken Simons have a very nice paper talking about how radio manufacturers were able to transition very well into television, right? And of course, the values of incumbency in automobiles in Silicon Valley, in fact, that is the basis of his theory. So now, I want to be really clear. I don't mean to say that creative destruction does not happen. That's not my point at all. That would be silly, in fact, right? I'm really focusing on the mechanisms articulated by by Christensen's theory, right, of disruption, and of course, the prescriptive remedies that really go with that. So, you know, the problem is in the popular literature, disruption is everywhere. Wikipedia lists dozens of examples. The consulting firm InnoSight, I think that's Christensen's firm, lists dozens more. According to Jill Lepore, almost every entrepreneur in Silicon Valley claims to have a disruptive innovation. This morning, I just read about how Reddit, like that disruption in the real estate industry really isn't happening. Instead of the real estate industry is changing the disruptive innovator, right, making it more like everybody else. Here's the TechCrunch Disrupt conference. Ecosystems of disruption. You know, in fact, Christensen and his co-authors list 77 examples. These are numerous to suggest that the theory has a great external validity, like it's a good broad-based theory. But, you know, what does a case study really do? Recall that a case study is a description of a single industry. That's one dot on the distribution. That's one observation, right? And at best, you know, it can tell us that there's something interesting. It can prove an existence case, but nothing more. It's difficult to generalize from one particular example, or as Jill Lepore wrote a little bit acerbically in the New Yorker last year, nowhere, and she's quoting, nowhere in the history of business has there been an industry like disk drives, Christensen writes, which makes it a very odd choice for an investigation designed to create a model for understanding other industries. Now, as Adner points out, the conditions needed for disruption may be, you know, they're kind of unusual. So first of all, organizational capabilities have to be fungible. So if you were good at one thing, there's an assumption you're going to be good at the next thing, right? And it's got this really weird demand structure. So the incumbent customers will like the new technology, but the new tech customers won't like the old technology. You have to have it so that the new technology serves these other customers, and eventually it gets good enough so that the incumbents will buy the old one. Right? The trajectories of the development have to be increasing in both. Right? And if that doesn't happen, it doesn't actually fit the theory. Right? And firms must only be able to search locally. They can't have this broad-based search. They can't be aware of things going outside, because if that were the case, they wouldn't be myopic. Right? So all these conditions have to happen. And lo and behold, when you actually look at that, so Clay Christensen and his co-authors have found about 77 cases. And according to Annie King and his co-author Balgir Batardak, right? It's a difficult thing to pronounce. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. I skipped something. So this reminded me of this cartoon. So I want to go through this cartoon with you guys because I like cartoons. And it gets to the problem with having unsupported series, the science news cycle. So look at this. So you can't read it very well, but you start out your research, and A is correlated with B, given C, assuming D and under conditions E, right? And then how does it do that? So then there's a press office, and your university has a PR office, in case you didn't know that. And for immediate release, scientists find potential link between A and B under certain conditions. All right? And then the newspapers get this, and where are the newspapers? Oh, and so here we go. Once the disruptive product gains a foothold in the new, that's too bad. There was a newspaper thing, and the newspapers then they get rid of they just say A causes B. Right? And then, so once the disruptive, so this is what Christian Rayner write, once the disruptive product gains a foothold on new or low-end markets, the disruptors are on a path that will ultimately crush the incumbents. Note that there are no caveats in this statement. So here we go. Newswire's organization, A causes B. And then we turn this in, it's no longer A is correlated with B, it is A causes B. So basically what we've done is we've outdone the cartoonists, because we start with A causes B, and that makes it a lot easier for all the press and everybody out. So look at 77 cases cited by Christensen and his co-authors, right? And Andy and Balgir look at they say, okay, so what do you need for this to be true, right? So you need that the incumbents have to be engaged in the sustaining innovation, right? And a lot of times, the incumbents simply are not engaged in sustaining innovation at all, right? So, and he considers several examples. Probably one of like a really nice one that Clay talks about is meat packing. So there used to be these butchers in the like last century, 2 centuries ago, and everybody hated them because they were using like really crappy, American Revolutionary War methods to process meat. And along came refrigeration and railroads and the original assembly line, which was called the disassembly line, and they were able to oust those guys. So, but it's not reasonable to think that those incumbents, all those local butchers, right, were engaging in any sustaining innovation. Another example is that sustaining innovations actually overshoot their customers' needs. Well, think of like, a form of surgery. What does overshooting mean? You've reduced the likelihood of death too much? Like, what is that? Right? It doesn't actually necessarily make sense. So, so there's maybe 22% of the cases where that happens. And then if you look at 3 at the bottoms, that the incumbents had the capabilities to respond, I don't know. Did railroads really have the capabilities to respond to the highway system and automobiles? Probably not, even though they were disrupted by the superhighway system. Right, so maybe not. So like that, maybe not such a good prescription for those companies. Or did the U.S. Postal Service really have the opportunity or the wherewithal to respond to AOL's email? That seems kind of a ludicrous sort of statement. And if it does, why didn't FedEx do it? Right? Because what's the difference? So, and then of course the incumbents fail, and a great percentage of the time the incumbents actually do not fail. So of the 77 cases cited by Christensen and his co-authors, only about 9%, which I'll help you with the translation, that's 7, actually conform to the theory. So I guess I'm a little bit jealous, right? Because look, The Economist named The Innovator's Dilemma as one of the 6 most important books about business ever written. I was like, gosh, I want to do that. I want to write a story that explains 7% of the variation and have somebody say it's one of the 6 most important books about business ever written. That's fantastic. I didn't know it was so easy. So where does that leave us? Okay, so disruptive innovation is a theory that's based on case analysis, but lacks scholarly empirical support for either internal or external validity. This may seem disturbing, okay? But in fact, this is the way of many theories. This doesn't disturb me too much, right? A scholar comes up with a theory based on some evidence or what maybe incorrect evidence, but nevertheless something that's kind of provocative and interesting, and then the invisible college chips away at the theory, and this is a scientific process at work. We shouldn't be so disturbed by this, right? But I think that there's something bigger at work here. Not only because you guys were supposed to laugh at that. I thought that was kind of a funny joke. I guess it's not. Okay. Not only because the theory of disruptive innovation has had such a high effect, I think this story points at the danger of allowing theory to be developed on a biased sample of cases. Here's what I think the real problem is. Tellis sounds out the first so Gerard Tellis sounds out the first warning bells, more in the marketing literature. Jill Laporte kind of amplifies them, and I think that King and Batartoga kind of really bring it into tune. To create a generalizable theory, we need a sample and a justification for why a sample is representative of the population of interest. This is basic science. Christensen and his co-authors have presented a theory of industries and have not attempted in any way to make any arguments as why their sample makes sense in terms of representativeness. One way to do this would be to say, let's take several industries based on certain criteria, say high-tech, low-tech manufacturing, services, and then explore the predictive validity across these different industries. Right? Instead, Christensen has assembled a series of cases sampled on, as far as I can tell, incumbents losing to new entrants. Right? So he's sampling on the dependent variable. Well, he thinks he is. So it turns out Andy kind of shows he isn't, but he thinks he is, right? And when a case appears not to comport, their strategy is to kind of calibrate the theory to the data. And I have to say, this is a really good strategy for lengthening the longevity of a theory, but it doesn't subject the theory at all to Popperian refutability. And this is a problem. This is a fundamental violation of the scientific methodology, and but it hasn't prevented illustrious scholars in our field, and certainly practitioners, for citing Christensen as gospel. And I believe that as scholars, our job is to separate science from religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. So we'll continue with Gautam.
Okay.
You use the podium, Gautam?
It's going to be a tough act to follow. Well, let me begin with a question.
That's it.
So,
Yeah.
the question is very simple. We've got about 100 people in this room. Give me an illustration of something that our field has discovered, a theory broadly defined as Fernando laid out earlier, that you can actually share with managers, and that is empirically validated in our world. Tell me. Hey, there's 100 people. Yeah. Okay, and exactly how much would that help any manager that would be willing to, is that, the point is it also has to be a little non-obvious, right? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's it, because otherwise what's the point or utility of the exercise? So if it's going to be just what they already know, there's no market for that information. Okay? I'm just trying to understand what is it that we are actually selling to that world. Now there is another world which consists of all of us here who have a different process or a different role in society, and I'll come to that in a minute. But tell me, there's got to be stuff, right? Things that we've replicated, yeah?
Intellectual property rights favor license.
Pardon?
Intellectual property rights favor license.
Okay, so you want, yeah, so basically, if you have a right on something which cannot be, sort of, well, it depends. Again, there's a contingency there. It's not very useful in China or India, right? But the point is, if you get to that, how non-obvious is that? How counterintuitive is that?
Well, many people talk about the weakness in intellectual property rights, and not many people realize that there isn't an upside.
Okay, yeah. See, the point I'm making is that I can take, to go back to Brent's idea of replication. Probably the most replicated study in our field, or most replicated relationship in our field, has to do with diversification, right? Literally, there are hundreds of studies. For those hundreds of studies, what do we know? So what is the answer to the related or unrelated diversification puzzle? What should we tell managers? Should they diversify in a related fashion, or should they diversify in an unrelated fashion, or should they not diversify at all? What is our consensus on that? Anybody with an answer? I think that's the single largest studied thing in our business, right? And actually, Ellen and I just completed or are working on a paper where just answering that simple question, we could find no way, I could find 40 ways to contravene it, but no cumulative evidence at all, right? And here are 100 of the smartest people in the field, and we're having difficulty uncovering we haven't even gotten to three things that the market, that managers thinking for half an hour don't actually figure out for themselves. Right? So that's the first part that I want to draw, is that in our business, there is no empirically validated theory to share with anybody. Right? So there is nothing that actually we come up with that we have historically been able to establish in 35 years, at least nothing that I could think of very consciously. Maybe there are extremely minute things, but I'll come to that in a moment, right? So the idea here is, and the idea is that findings of theories from strategy research that are supported by empirical evidence incontrovertibly, and of these, how many are actually used by managers after we had established them empirically, right? So maybe there's another question. How many companies can you name that have focused on a strategy, model, or theory, call it whatever you want to, and that is conclusively associated with their success? Because this is a field that claims that we are trying to help firms make the most possible money. So give me an illustration of companies that you know, and you can tap them onto, here's a theory they used, and they were successful.
Can we do the opposite?
Huh? Tell me.
They used and they went the other way?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that would be
So like small technologies, like the camera company, they tried to disrupt from below, and they failed because the competition clobbered them.
And now, if we take this into the domain, so how were we so confident that that the theory was actually guiding their decisions?
Well, Clay advised them.
Okay, well, that's possible. But see, the point is, in all of this, we could. I mean, I have no idea whether, you know. Again, I don't want to get into any single specific theory. So I don't care about, you know, what a precise illustration here is for those things. All I want to say is, as a general principle, because I want to make a bigger point here. And the bigger point is, what do we actually do research for? Right? What is the goal of research, or in an applied field such as management? So I'll come back to that in a moment. But so. It seems to me that there are three hard truths we should all face up to. First of all, the practice of management very rarely awaits empirical evidence. That's not new. It always happens. You know, we are often at the rear guard of what happens, and we're not at the vanguard of things. Almost no strategy frameworks or models have hard support, where I define hard as incontrovertible and marketable. And at the same time, it's very difficult to associate specific frameworks or models with corporate outcomes, right, in any large sample setting that we'd like to be racing. So the question is, why does that happen? Why do you think that the practice of management very rarely awaits empirical evidence? Because again, see, everything that Brent said, I believe in terms of, as a scientist, if I am thinking about the progress of science. However, the objective before us was not whether it is about the progress of science, but whether managers should wait for us to validate things. And that's why I want to tackle that aspect of the problem. So why do you think it is that the practice of management rarely awaits empirical evidence? Yeah? Why did they not wait for all the, you know, hundreds of, you know, refinements that could be done? Any thoughts? Yeah. See, the thing is, managers are focused on a competitive edge, some uniqueness that gives them an advantage. By the time a regression discovers a positive association between a strategy and its outcome, very likely the strategy is already diffused so widely that its employment will not confer a significant advantage, right? So if you wait, see, statistical analysis works on the basis of averages. What managers like to pay for is the exception, the outlier, right? So that is one aspect of this story. Let's go to the second question. Why do almost no strategy frameworks or models or theories have hard support? Why is it so difficult to find support for them? Yeah? Which is? And that's one possibility, that the effect disappears as everybody absorbs or diffuses, you know, the thing, and you can go back to Armour and Teese, and you see that very clearly in that period 1 and period 2 analyses, okay? Anything else? Yeah? Yeah, and another way of framing that idea would be that almost everything that is reasonably counterintuitive that we can possibly hope to advise people for also tends to be very complex. There are multiple interactive relationships there. And it is very, very difficult in our socially driven science to actually have some kind of a, you know, experiment that allows us to parse that thing very, very closely. And so the point is that even when you establish a theory, usually some part of it is still uncovered, you know, is still not in place, and you've got to go along and work with it. Finally, why is it so difficult to associate specific frameworks or models with corporate outcomes? Why do we have so few instances? Yeah. See here, I think the important thing is that, and this I think is really the point I wanted to make out of this extended sort of play, which is that we have the luxury and in fact the responsibility of testing things in ceteris paribus conditions so that we can isolate the partial effects of things. Managers almost never have that luxury. So any finding that we do validate is only of partial interest to the manager because they're never going to be holding other things constant. So, and where I'm going with this is that what I want to understand is from a manager's perspective, what is the purpose of the work we do? Right? And that's the goal here. So the idea here is since this is not something that they can really ever manage, the idea, even if we establish something very, very closely, they're actually going to see a multiple sort of regression context where they can't separate the regressors, so they've got to play with that, right? So the idea is that, and that brings us to the broader question. What are all the reasons we do research in the first place? Okay? And you can think of, so what are some of the reasons we do research for? Mm-hmm. Guys, that's what we do for a living. We should have a good reason for it. We've dedicated our lives to it, to say nothing of society's resources. So what is the objective of doing research in our business? What are we trying to do? Create knowledge. Okay, let's be more precise. Knowledge in what form or shape? What precisely are we trying to do? Mm-hmm. Any other? Yeah? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Okay, so creating actionable knowledge. Okay, so that's one thing we want to do. What else do we do? Yeah? So create heuristics for, again, action in some fashion. Is that the idea? Or simplification of cognitive decision making and so on? Yeah? Okay, what else? Okay, establish benchmarks, provide an empirical basis for what the world looks like, a descriptive empirical basis. What else? Okay. Okay, to make sense of the world, right? So that is another form of knowledge, okay? Anything else? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I thought I'd put some candidates out there, right? Some of these are very straightforward. It's what we do, and they're so deeply embedded in us that we don't even think twice about it. So first of all, we try to establish the causes or non-causes of event theoretically, right? The old causality question. Then we say, well, let's establish empirically the causal effects of courses of action, right? We try to validate this. That is the subject of, this is what we do. Sometimes we don't even have a theory. So this is whereas, Brent's first slide was, theory without evidence. This is the idea of evidence without theory. We put down empirical regularities in terms of what they do and so on and so forth. But it's the fourth one that I want to highlight, specifically in the context of what we do in business schools and in our field of management, which is that I think a very important part of research is simply, and that's the reason I think that to some level, society sort of subsidizes us. Just think of the entire resource commitment to the research enterprise made by society. If at the end of all of that effort for 35, 40 years that our field has been around, in an audience like this, we cannot come up with 4 or 5 great findings that would not have been obvious otherwise, I'd say people will be asking a lot of questions of what they spent their money on, right? So if you think of it from that perspective, there's got to be something else beyond the actual outcome of our research that they are paying for. And at least my conjecture is that partly one of the reasons why society subsidizes us is it's not the output of the research that's relevant, but it's the process itself. That and some of the ways that it does is, first of all, we try to develop abstractions that can be used to characterize the world. But a very important one is the second one. And this is actually goes back to go back to Ayer's idea of what do we try to do, create knowledge. I'm going back to Huber's classic definition of what is learning. It's an expansion of the range of potential behaviors available to the decision maker. And that is a very, very big component of what is really significant in what we do from a practical perspective. So it might be the case that only 9 of the 77 studies were consistent with the pattern that Brent was identifying. But in part, that's missing the point, because the point of that type of research, or that kind of where the output is the actual manager, is not to think of all the places where this thing is, or whether or not this is the true for the general case. What is important is, does it add to the set of possibilities that I, as a manager, consider? So I'll take this, though I said I will not take any illustrations. In this particular case, I will take an illustration. I'll take the one that Brent talked about, which is that Brent showed us the entire, going from bottom to top and all of that. And all of that I buy. I think that's the thing. The issue is this. What is the true value of a theory of disruptive innovation? Now, first of all, we do have an implicit market value there, because clearly there were lots of companies that were interested in it. But the other part is, what is the default assumption made by a manager? That I will be knocked over by something that is cooler and sexier than I am. And where does the attention of the manager focus? On that cooler and sexier part of the world. So they're looking at things above them and saying, that's where the threat's going to come from. In that world, if I'm able to come up with something which causes me to say, hey, you know what? I hadn't thought of that. It wasn't on my list of things to be worried about. Now, that may happen one case of 100, but that one is more valuable. It's not about the regression, the R squared on this regression. It's about that one thing that I hadn't thought about, which is added to the universe of the possibilities that the manager was considering. So to my mind, that is the real value of this. Now, I don't know how many of you have actually interacted with and tried to sell an idea to a manager in any position of serious responsibility. I have, okay? And here's the interesting thing. They're almost impossible to sell ideas to. So it's not like they have this completely, sort of acceptable, you tell us and we'll do it. They use their own judgment. And sometimes, in fact, in my particular case, and that is probably unique to me, their judgment is usually more correct than mine, okay? So that is part of the story here that I want to highlight, is that it is really the broadening of the expansion of repertoires of actions that really is the purpose of some of this work. It's to draw attention to these things. Similarly, you go back to the core competence idea. CK wrote that paper in 1990. What was happening in the period up to 1990? What was the given sort of managerial sort of default at that period? Anybody remembers from the 1980 to 1990 period what was going on in the corporate world? I'm just trying to put it in context. That was the era of the mega diversified corporation, right? So people were imitating each other and building mega diversified corporations. And in that world, he said, well, you know what? There's a value to not being diversified across the world, a value to sticking to your knitting. Now, out of context in another period, yes, has anybody ever found evidence for core competence? I don't know, but that's part of the same story, right? So the idea is, so what matters more? Is it utility or the strength of the empirical evidence, right? Now, again, I'm not saying any of this, I'm not defending any of this on the basis of what we should be doing in our academic work. All I'm saying is that there is another audience, and that audience requires help in thinking about it. And the answer here is it really depends upon the purpose. If the goal is to establish a theory conclusively, then we might argue that the strength of the empirical evidence dominates. We shouldn't be doing this. But I don't know that it is always the goal of, to establish the theory as opposed to trying to help the management. I mean, very simple illustration. I take statin drugs. Actually, I take a statin drug, let me be clear. And I took it under the assumption that that will help me live longer because that's what my doctor told me. Then I have a good friend called Ashish Arora who has made a lifetime out of disabusing people of the mistakes that they believe in. And he then pointed out to me, and I completely believe him. I haven't tested it or checked it, but I completely believe him. He tells me, what is the number of studies that the FDA has which shows you that statin drugs actually prolong your life or prevent a heart attack? Take a guess. It's a very simple number. It's the easiest of numbers. It's actually 0, okay? Now, take that a little bit further. So we're talking about, validating theories before putting them into action. Now, it turns out that in another context, just recently, I had a family member who had some health issues, and they asked me, because I'm in principle in my family, they think because I'm a doctor, DR, I should have the answers. And so they asked me to, because they're looking for some very frontier research because the situation is fairly serious. And so they asked me to look up what was the state of the art of treatment. So I actually went to the thing. So in this case, lives are depending on it. And I actually pulled up what the doctor had recommended and what the FDA had to say about these drugs. And what was interesting to me is that these drugs had been approved by the FDA and were going to be taken by people whose lives depended on them. And the actual analysis, if you look at it, they had multiple mechanisms of action. And how much of this theory was actually validated? What do you think was the author's sort of take on this? What were they saying? We have no idea which of these is working. All we can tell you is, here is the control sample, here is the treatment sample, one got a better result than the other, ergo go ahead and jump into it. So the point is that the empirical validation often doesn't occur at the theoretical level, even in the basic sciences or sciences where people actually die when you make wrong decisions. So utility is an important criterion of these things, and that is where some of this has to be kept in mind for, right? So the idea is, now, at the same time, and let me go back to what Brent had earlier brought up, which is, why is empirical evidence important, right? So if I take my own argument to its nth conclusion, then anything that is plausible and expands the manager's range of potential behaviors is a defensible publication. So then where is the limit to that? What is the conditioning effect? And there I draw your attention to the ASQ editorial statement, which says something of the order, I don't know if it's still there, but for a long time it carried that, is that we seek papers that establish a novel theory or something like that, but are also empirically validated. Why have both? Isn't establishing a novel theory in pure theoretical terms good enough? So why are they asking for the second level of this thing? What is the importance of validation? And I think there are at least, one basic idea is validation between theory and evidence is the bedrock of all science, and that's sort of there. But I think for our field, it's particularly important because our most common mode of reasoning is verbal rather than formal. In formal reasoning, you have to lay down your precepts, and then the internal consistency of the system serves as a way to check or test it. In our world, when it's verbal, we don't even know what are the hidden assumptions. And having the empirical evidence which finds fault with it, or is either supports it or doesn't support it, that really helps to further our understanding. And that's very important because our relationships are almost always complex. So I'm saying that there is a real value to the idea of disruptive innovation going out there, and there is an equally good value to Brent finding that 9 of the 82 or 77, whatever cases it worked, and the others, it was not directly applicable, because now it's going to help us think even more clearly about the conditional elements of it. Yeah. So the idea here is well-reasoned, plausible arguments that are timely may be as important as heavily validated theories. Right? So for the particular incident that I was looking at, I could have a choice, wait for when the drugs would actually, the mechanism of action could be cleared, or I could have the drug applied today. And guess which one we chose. So overall, the point out was that in our business, establishing something conclusively is very, very difficult. Experimental design is difficult. Instruments are relatively impossible to find effectively, and very often when they are available, you're searching under the lamppost rather than under where you lost the keys, is the old analogy. Very importantly, all the strategy is endogenous anyway. Nobody says that people go out there and pick a strategy out of a hat and do it, right? So to try and say that I have completely resolved the problem of endogeneity, if that is true, you've probably found something that is very, very atypical, because it was not the appropriate response to something. So it's not clear to me that we will have, and as you go deeper, that many of the natural experiments that we actually bring about may actually represent non-equilibrium solutions or situations, okay? And therefore, they might be non-representative behavior and may not be generalizable for that reason. So I'll sort of stop here. I think that I've kind of touched upon the other stuff as well. And the core idea is that scientific advancement of theory and practical utility are different goals, and that recognition suggests that, and that recognition suggests that empirical establishment of a theory is not a necessary precondition for its applicability and diffusion. If it is plausible, well-reasoned, and especially if it draws the manager's attention to opportunities, threats, or strategic choices that the manager may have overlooked, the theory has earned its keep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. Thanks a lot. We have a few minutes for, and we have 2 microphones for questions here or comments from the audience. I think that'll be interesting. We have lots of people with much experience in research here. So if you want to voice your comment or a question for any of the panelists, that was interesting, opposite perspectives, I think, in many ways. Maybe, and let me just start, because we have just only 10 minutes, but let me just start by asking Brent, actually, I think, let me repeat Gautam's question to the audience, to you, Brent. So which, because I mean, we get your point, but so which of the theories that we typically use in management do you think has been well tested, if any?
No, that's a very nice question. So I think we know some stuff, right? Like, so I think some of the things that we teach and think about come from management, some come from economics. So I think we have a pretty good idea how competition affects margins, right? So I think we know that pretty well. I think we have a good idea of different sources of different types of entry barriers, such as patents, right? And so, and I also think that it's a twofold answer. I'm going to change the question a little bit. Okay.
That's fine.
Yeah. So there are 2 things. So just saying that something is interesting, which is kind of, and may enlarge the possibility of action, does not give us, or should not give us the right to go propagate and advise based on theories that have no basis. Right? So if you think about like what is particularly insidious about disruption is it instills fear in the manager. You will fail if you do not do this. Right? And then what happens after that is a lot of money gets spent trying not to fail. And often it's just it's wasted. These are resources that our society has that could be better used in other ways. Right? And there are great examples of this. What is Polaroid doing getting into the digital, trying to get into a digital camera business, or Kodak for that matter? Those are very different firms built for very different technologies, and those efforts failed because that was just a poor strategic choice, right?
Just as a clarification, they were way before the disruptive innovation model, though. Yeah. And those companies you're referring actually were way before Christensen publishing his model. So.
Yeah, that's true.
Kodak's digital imaging
from the 80s.
started in 1981.
I'm well aware, but the disruption happened in the 90s. So but there's a host of examples. That doesn't mean that we should go out and say this is what we should do. How many startups are now in Silicon Valley attempting to disrupt without pausing to consider whether the assumptions in Clay's model have any validity? I'm sure they don't.
Can I ask a question unrelated to that?
Yes, please. Mary, wait for the microphone, Mary.
So Brent, I would argue that many of the folks using the term disruption have no idea what Clay's model actually says, and they are simply using the term disruption to mean doing something innovative or different. And so in the sense of, are we encouraging managers to not kind of sit back on their laurels and, you know, assume they don't have to do anything, but realize that they actually need to think out of the box, they need to have approaches to encourage creativity, all the sorts of things that we try to do to shake up large organizations. You know, I might argue that regardless of what the technical definition of disruptive innovation was in Clay's work, the fact that he's raised awareness among managers of the need to engage in innovation is a good and positive thing. And we're going to talk offline about the problems of Kodak and Polaroid, because they developed amazing technologies related to digital.
They did.
Any more comments over here? Aja, over here.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask Gautam, so when you talk to senior managers and you're trying to sell ideas, so how do you select the ideas that you think would be helpful in expanding their horizons and their action potential?
Good question. That's a great question. I actually select ideas not on the basis of whether there is empirical evidence for them or not, but whether they make sense for me logically, and whether I am able to provide for them the conditions under which I think that will work. So I actually never, and it's usually not the same advice to two firms at the same time. So I don't go with the idea that related diversification is good for you or bad for you. I listen to them. And sometimes when I hear them, I realize that my own precondition was wrong. My own assessment was wrong. So, and therefore, I think I've learned a lot by simply not trying to educate them with the theories that I know are empirically validated, but they're empirically validated on biased or limited samples. I just tried to hear what they're trying to tell me. And I learned a lesson very early on in when my dissertation, where I was using the existing literature to test a relationship. And at all points of time, I couldn't get the damn thing to work. It was giving me the opposite effect. And for a long time, I tried to twist it in every possible way to get it to give me the right answer, what I thought was the right answer. And finally, I gave up. And that's when I learned that listening to the data was a much better thing that I could do than listening to the theory. And in that process, I actually wrote up a paper which ended up, giving me a fair amount of mileage, which I would not have done, it would never have done if I'd gone with the original insistence on what theory actually told me. So the idea was, and I've learned very much. See, it's many things that and it's my, personal variant of the wisdom of crowds or whatever you want to call it. That very often when people say things and they believe in them strongly, and they're sensible people overall, even if they cannot articulate the reasons and their logic seems to be the opposite of what your empirical evidence tells you, it's worth listening to them, because almost always there's an omitted variable there. And once you account for the omitted variable, what they're saying makes a lot of sense. And so I think the one thing I have learned from going out into the corporate world, and maybe it doesn't quite show up in my behavior because I'm, a jerk of a certain type, but is humility, okay? And maybe I have to have my sort of nose rubbed into the dirt a few more times, and then I might actually embody it in my behavior. But the reality is that there are lots of people, they're working under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And yes, are they bad judgments being provided to them, or bad decisions they're making? Very much so. But on average, they're not an easy group to just sell stuff to. Yeah.
Alfonso?
Well, first of all, let me thank you guys. I mean, these were two very profound presentations, and I learned a lot. And I moved throughout from one side to the other side, and then I realized in the end that clearly you guys took an extreme position to make the point, but it's very clear that you are far closer to the middle on the issue. Let me just make one point. And this point, we have talked about managers, but there is also another community we talk to, and this is our students. And somehow in talking to our students, we face a very important problem and different from the managers. When you talk to a manager, he or she has a particular company and a particular problem in mind. When you talk to students, you're talking to a bunch of people whom will actually do very different things in the future, and you have no idea. So basically, when you have to talk to them, you have to think of something general enough that would be useful to them. And this is why I think we cannot escape generalizations in our field. So even when we teach a case study, we teach a case study because we think that that case study, it's useful to a bunch of them to make a general point. So we do have a model in mind, even when we teach a case study. And in that respect, the credit I would like to give to Brent is that if we have the wrong model in mind, or if we have the wrong theory, I think this is a problem. And so I welcome the idea that let's at least have some generalizations that actually work, of which we are confident about. But then, of course, there are all the issues that Gautam is raising that we should also be careful about.
Thank you. You want to respond to that?
Sure.
Any of you?
Yeah, I think Alfonso is raising a very, very valid question, that our responsibilities to our two audiences, even in the practical world, are different. And again, I think I'll go take a cue from Ayaz, what do I actually do about it? So one of the things that I have historically maintained right from the first day of class, and I show it as this thing is that, remember, everything I'm telling you, almost everything I'm telling you can either be contravened, you can find evidence on either side of it. So the only argument that you have is that we have this collective intelligence in the room, there are 95 of us. If something doesn't make sense, speak up. And the first time that somebody challenges me or challenges somebody else, I make a point of celebrating it. And the message gets around very clearly is that there are no sacred cows in this room. Right? And the idea is that it is a very incomplete state of the field that we are providing you, a sense of the field that we are providing you. And I completely agree with you, because I take it to one extreme. Every case is selected only because I can, at the end, come up with a generalizable model at the end of it, right? And it may have certain contingencies and so on, but that's what I'm leading to. And then I leave it for them to make the call. And it's amazing how many times those 95 people, somebody has drawn attention to. And the easiest empirical evidence I have of this is when the first time I teach a case, the notes that I write down, which was my unstinted, fully informed, scientific this thing, and the 10th time that I teach it, and it is amazing how much transformation has occurred along the way. Because that collective intelligence of 95 people is pointing out to me. And that's also led to papers that I have subsequently written and so on. But I fully am completely, that there has to be a mechanism that disciplines us also from seeing it. So I am very clear that I do not have the answers. I have a way of thinking about a problem. And this thing, it's interesting, in one of the things, I go back to what, I was talking to one of the CEOs who had been told by some former students of mine that I would be a nice person to bring in and talk to them. And he asked me, he says, so what's your shtick? So can you tell me in 2 or 3 minutes what's the big message here? I said, I don't have a shtick. I talk about a way of making decisions in a systematic fashion. And that process is really what I can share with you. So if you want a 2-minute shtick or a 2-hour shtick, I'm not the guy for you. Get somebody else, because if I'm going to come in, I'm going to spend a week with you. And we'll think about things, and you have to have the patience, and if you don't have the patience or you don't have the week, leave me out of it. And in that case, they chose to leave me out of it, which was fine with me. Yeah. Okay.
I really appreciate it. And I think at the end of the day, Gautam and I agree on quite a bit. I agree with Alfonso. I think that's true. Yeah. And what I'm reading, what I'm inferring is like Gautam is like saying, at the end of the day, there's no shortcuts. You have to think critically about situations, and they're idiosyncratic. And I completely actually agree with that. The problem is that there's a huge market out there for people who don't want to hear that message. And instead, they take these very simple theories and they apply them without going through that critical thinking. And those people actually control a huge amount of resources. So that leads to billions of dollars of waste if we're not careful and responsible in the way we advertise what we know.
I just want to, in closing this panel, first of all, I want to thank Brent and Gautam for their participation. This is actually, I knew it was a little bit tricky to put them together here because they will be having different opinions. As I said at the beginning, I've done both theory and empirical work, and I have a lot of respect for both of these positions. I do think that actually that coming up with a good idea, even though Brent suggested that it could be easy, it's actually not that easy. I think it's important both, to have the good ideas out there, even though they're not tested, and then you're hopefully actually having some validation through empirical work. So thank you so much, guys. This is great. Thank you for coming.
That was fine. That was good. That's good.
And I will be seeing you shortly in Maryland.
That was good. Very good. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernando. Hey, John, good to see you.
Managed to create
Oh, thank you.
points, to different perspectives. I think you gave too much.